All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to July's webinar. Today, we're going to be joined by Vanessa Robinson of DairyNZ, and she's going to be speaking to us about calf rearing and welfare. And yeah, she can answer any questions that you have at the end of the session, or yeah, you can post any of them throughout, and I'll try to interrupt her if there's a moment, and she can address those for you. So yeah, I'll hand it over to you, Vanessa.
Awesome, thanks, Claire. As Claire said, I'm talking about calf rearing, so just a bit of, I guess, background as to why I'm talking about that. So I work in the feed and animal team at DairyNZ based in Lincoln. Also calf rear the calves on our own farm where we contract milk 400 cows in Canterbury as well. So get to kind of test some of this out myself to see the practicalities, which is pretty cool. So I guess, why we want to talk about calf rearing. Obviously, the calves, as we bring them through, are going to be the future of our herd, but why do we want to grow them well, and what does it matter if they meet targets or not? So I guess just to kind of set the scene, there's a well-grown heifers that do meet their growth targets. They're getting calf better, they will produce more and they'll live longer. And they also have reduced illness and deaths during rearing, which leads for, I guess, just a happier time for your staff and calves through that period with less stress. And that fact around living longer, so it means that we're going to get a better return on investment. So on average, it takes around $1,400 to $2,000 to rear a heifer through to their first lactation. And so we want to be able to keep them in the herd as long as possible so that they can pay that back. So that cost is roughly around 200 to 300 kilograms of milk solids at a $6.50 payout. So some heifers will take more than one lactation to, I guess, start being profitable animals rather than paying off that, start to life, and particularly if it's a lower payout. So we really want to make sure that they are meeting those targets and we're giving them the best start in life to help with that. So today we want to cover off a little bit about colostrum and then talking through a few feeding strategies that are becoming more popular and more talked about as well, and then finish off with a wee bit around meal and where some of those recommendations come from. So in terms of colostrum, hopefully you guys are all familiar with, but we have a thing with colostrum around the 3 Qs. So that's, we want people to be thinking about quality, quantity, and quickly. And so what that means though, so for quality, we really want high quality colostrum, and so we recommend testing that with a Brix refractometer, and you're looking for more than 22%. And so what that means is that that colostrum has a really high level of antibodies. So calves are born with with a naive immune system. So as opposed to humans, where we get all of our immunity through the placenta from mum, and while we're growing in the womb, calves don't have any of that. So when they're born, they are completely susceptible to all of their disease. And so they need to be able to get antibodies out of that colostrum in order to be able to build up some immunity quickly. So that's where we want high quality with lots of antibodies in it. Quantity, so we're looking at around 4 litres in the first 6 to 12 hours. So we do need to split that up into 2 feeds of about 2 litres per feed, because when calves are born, they don't have a huge capacity in their stomach to hold milk. So we do have to break that up into smaller amounts for them to be able to absorb that. And then we want to look at quickly. So this graph here shows that along the bottom we've got time from 0 at birth through to 24 hours after birth. And on the side there we've got the percentage of antibodies that calves can actually absorb from the milk or the colostrum. And so when they're born, they can absorb about 30% of the antibodies that are in the colostrum. And then by 12 hours, that's gone right down to only 5% absorption. And by 24 hours, virtually nothing. And that's why we're really big on that first 6 to 12 hours. And then obviously the higher quality is, and the more antibodies to start with, then the more they're going to be able to get out at 30%. So that's why we really want to get the highest quality that we can. A common question that we do get around, I guess, giving the milk is, should we be tubing our calves or is bottle feeding and teat feeding better for them? So obviously out in the paddock, if they're going to drink off mum, it's, teat, so it's very similar to a bottle feeding system. But what we have found is that there's not actually a lot of difference between tubing and not tubing in terms of getting the milk into the calf. The great thing about tubing is that we can know exactly how much has been consumed and that it's got on where it needs to go, whereas generally, if we're going to put them on the teat, you may bottle feed, which gives you that, or it may be a group feeding system, again, if you've got multiple calves. So you may not be able to guarantee that they've all had that 2 litres. Probably the biggest thing to be concerned about is not necessarily the method that we get the milk in, but it's the quality and the cleanliness of the milk. So the hygiene of the milk is probably more important than the method that we actually give it to them in terms of making sure that they can absorb antibodies. So in terms of hygiene, some real basic things that we can do to keep that quality and cleanliness of our milk and colostrum would be using just hot soapy water. So you can just use detergent like you use at home, but cleaning up our gear regularly. So that includes everything from collection through to feeding. So our test buckets, our cafeterias and anything in between where we use to store as well. And probably one of the biggest things that we can do, and I know that I've definitely missed this in the past as well, but putting a lid on stored colostrum makes a really huge difference. So I don't know how often some of you guys have gone out there and there's been a dead bird in your colostrum, or the dog's trying to drink it, or you might be hosing down the tanker pad and some of the cow shit ends up in the barrel with the colostrum, and you think, oh wow, like it's only a little bit, she'll be right. But all of that adds more bacteria, which means that colostrum and that milk will deteriorate a lot quicker. And that is then getting into a calf that may or may not have a well-developed immune system. So it's putting them on the back foot. So that's where actually the hygiene of that milk is much more important. And then just some of the basics around making sure that you're feeding from youngest to oldest, because your oldest have had a longer time to build up immunity, so they're less likely to get sick off some of the bugs that you may introduce from the younger ones, whereas if you went the opposite way. And then keeping those sick calves to last and making sure that you clean down all of your gear and yourself once you're finished up with them, so that we're not spreading that around to the healthy calves. So I guess that was my spiel on colostrum and kind of moving into feeding strategies. So for this section, I just really wanted to address some of the key questions or comparisons that people have come up with in the industry, and looking at, should I be doing this or that? So the first one is around once a day or twice a day feeding of my calves, and what should I be doing? What's better for the calf? So the key thing to understand here is that for once a day and twice a day, they can both produce the same outcomes. So if we're thinking in terms of weight gain, nutritional status, and metabolic stress, both once a day and twice a day systems, when they're done well, can produce the same outcomes. What we do recommend is, around those first 10 to 14 days from birth, around using a twice a day system there. So I alluded earlier to the fact that we need to split those first 4 litres up into 2 feeds, because the calf's stomach can't hold enough milk in it. And so that, over those first few weeks, the capacity of the calf's stomach is going to grow. So if we start feeding them once a day from the beginning, there is the risk that they're not going to get enough milk in their system and to maintain energy, and that will stint growth and make them more at risk to disease, because they don't have the right level of energy. And although they may be starting to pick at the meal, they're also not going to be getting a lot of energy from that, because they won't be able to actually digest it at such an early stage either. So it's just around making sure at the beginning they're getting enough energy into them for those first few weeks, and then after that they'll have the capacity to be able to go on once a day and take enough in over that time. Another really common comparison that we've had particularly lately is around high volume versus low volume. And so there's been a lot more talk around ad lib feeding, which is a type of high volume. And so the low volume is our more traditional approach. It was developed back in the 20s as a way to encourage quick uptake of solid feeds such as meal and pasture, because they're a lot cheaper than feeding milk. And so this was designed to help fast track getting calves off of milk, basically. So there is the positive there that we can wean earlier on the system because the calf's rumen has developed adequately. But there is a risk there in the beginning period, depending on how much milk you are feeding, that there may be low energy intakes. And as the calves are adjusting to meal, they may not be getting enough energy out of the restricted level of milk and then the wee bit of meal that they are eating. And again, that puts them at increased risk of disease over those first couple of weeks of life. On the flip side, with high volume, you can lead to increased weaning weights. The issue here is that generally they will grow faster because they can consume a lot of milk, but then sometimes we do need to keep them on milk for a fair bit longer because they haven't felt the need to start eating solid feed, so their rumen isn't developing as much, and so then we actually need to keep them on milk longer so that we can allow them to develop their ability to digest solid feed before we pop them on grass. Again, because of their energy level, they may be less susceptible to disease at the beginning, but there generally is a higher cost. And depending on how you run your system, there may or may not be higher labour requirements as well. So if you're just feeding them more times a day, that's going to be more labour. But if you go on an ad lib system, then it may be a lot more simpler if you're just topping up milk once a day. But it's really important to remember that we can't just top up the milk and leave. We still need to be spending time looking at the calves and checking for signs of ill health and things like that every day, because they are young and things can change really quickly. So we need to not overlook that. So I guess to summarise that, both systems can, again, like once a day, twice a day, both systems can lead to successful weaning weights and weaning times. But it's just around managing what's going to be right for your system and how you can best manage that through the spring. So milk versus milk replacer. So it's not quite as common, but we do get a few questions around that. And generally in New Zealand, milk is going to be more cost effective because we produce quite high levels of waste milk around the first 8 milkings that aren't going to be saleable to the factory. And so, but what we have found is that milk replacer can be cost effective in higher payout years, where actually taking milk out of the vat might be costing you a lot more, or for systems that do sell that first 8 days colostrum and they have less excess milk, then it may be more cost effective for them to be looking at milk replacer as an option. But I guess the key thing to remember with milk replacer is it's not always that cost is the driving factor. So one of the biggest benefits of feeding milk replacer can be due to the fact that it's a lower risk of spreading diseases. So if you've got a high prevalence of disease such as Johne's or other diseases that can be spread through the milk to the young stock, then actually using milk replacer helps to break that chain. So there are some other reasons that farms might do it, same as automated calf feeding systems generally require milk replacer. So it's all around finding what works best for your system. The key things to look out for if you are looking at a milk replacer is to think about looking at what protein they use. So some milk replacers can use plant-derived proteins and the calf actually can't digest them as well as they can milk proteins. So looking at, if they provide a source for that. And the other one is around fat. So generally milk replacer will have a lower fat level than whole milk, and high fat can be valuable, particularly under ad lib or high growth situations because that fat adds more energy. Or if it's quite cold where you're calving or a untypically cold season, then it will help to support that additional energy to keep them warm and still grow. So although I've talked about those two key things, not all products will state the sources of their nutrients. So it may not state if it's plant or animal derived. So it's just important to be looking at using a reputable brand that's been proven in feeding young calves. So that means that the calves are going to be able to do well with it. So that's probably just a wee bit of advice there around, if you are looking at it, a few tips to help pick the right one for your system. And finally, yes, wanted to finish up a wee bit about meal and, do we need meal? What role does it play? So for this, I'm using some information out of Penn State University around rumen development. So I'm going to show a few pictures of calf rumens at 6 weeks of age. So the first one up here is, this is the rumen wall of a calf at 6 weeks old that's been fed milk only. So if we were to compare that to a newborn calf, it is a lot whiter and a lot more musculature. So it's built up quite a bit of muscle and strength, but you can see there that it's still really smooth on the wall. And so what we want with the rumen is we want to develop a lot of texture on the wall, and it's called papillae, and they're like finger-like little protrusions that come out of the wall, and basically their role is to increase the surface area of the rumen, and that means that the calf and then adult cow, as it grows older, can absorb and digest more nutrients and energy out of the feed that they're eating. And so if we compare milk only to a calf that's had milk and hay, so a forage-based diet, at 6 weeks, you can see that it's a little bit darker, and there are some, we're starting to get a little bit of texture there, but still not a lot when we compare it to what we can get if we feed milk and grain. So, a meal-based type generally includes a grain level. And so you can see here a really richness in colour and a lot of texture there on the wall of the rumen. And so what that's doing, as I said, is increasing the surface area, which means that that calf can absorb more energy and more nutrients out of any feed that it's getting. And so the other really important factor, other than the type of feed, is water. So clean water during that process will really help to build the right environment to help that growth go along as well. So it's quite important to make sure they have access to clean water. And so what this does show here is, though, that although milk and grain gets you there at 6 weeks and it gives you a really good development rate, we can still get there without meal. So we can still use forage-based things like hay and straw and pasture. It's just going to take longer for the calf to get to that same level of rumen development, which means a little bit longer before they can actually start digesting the pasture feed as well and getting enough energy out of it, which means slightly slower growth rates and a probably longer weaning process to help remove the weight, the chicken growth. So that's, I guess, a little bit of science around why we do recommend feeding meal and having it in there early, because it just helps to fast track that, which means we have less issues going on later in life as we remove milk from the diet. So I guess as a bit of a summary, when we're thinking about colostrum, those 3 Qs are really important. Quality, quantity, and quickly. If we can do those, it's going to make a huge difference to giving them a really good start in life. And then what I hope you've really got out of looking at those comparisons is that really it's down to picking a system that's going to suit your farm and setup. So if you choose a system that doesn't going to suit your farm very well and you can't execute it well, then you're probably not going to get good results, even though it may be what's recommended. So making sure that it's going to suit your farm setup and you guys can, as a farm team, carry it out well is going to be your best bet. And then, as I said now, just provide fresh meal and water to all of your calves from day dot, because it will really help them to build up that rumen development quickly. And the key thing really is to monitor and review as you go. So, we're never going to have it perfect from the get-go. So actually, when things are happening, thinking about why might that have happened and what can I do to make it better as you go will help you to tweak the system to be the best that it can be. So with that, I'll see if there's any questions.
Well, thank you, Vanessa. That was great. Really interesting to see the difference in the rumen in just a few weeks.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. No questions seem to have come through at this point. So yeah, we might just wrap it up. But that was great. Thank you very much for that.